There's a moment in the life cycle of every empire when the decline becomes irreversible, not because of a single battle lost or a king assassinated, but because of numbers that no longer add up. Throughout history, from Rome to China, from the Ottomans to the British, empires have collapsed following the exact same financial script. Different languages, different gods, different continents, but the math is always identical. And here's what should terrify anyone paying attention. That script is playing out again right now. Not in some distant corner of the world, but in the very systems we trust to hold society together. Let me show you the pattern that has destroyed every great power in history, why it's mathematical, and why recognizing it early is the only thing that separates those who survive the collapse from those who are destroyed by it. Before we get into the mechanism, you need to understand what empire actually means. Not in the ceremonial sense, crowns and thrones, but in practical terms. An empire is an economic system that extracts more resources than it produces. It conquers, taxes, and controls territory to fund a central power structure. The empire provides security, infrastructure, and trade networks. In exchange, it takes wealth from the periphery and concentrates it at the center. This works brilliantly during expansion. New conquests bring gold, slaves, resources, and tribute. The military pays for itself through plunder. The economy grows because new markets open. Citizens prosper because wealth flows inward. This is the golden age, the part everyone remembers. Rome under Augustus, the Ottomans under Suleiman, Britain under Victoria. These are empires at maximum expansion, maximum confidence, maximum wealth. But empires don't stay in expansion forever. Eventually, you run out of places to conquer. The borders stabilize. And when expansion stops, the math changes completely. Because now you have all the costs of empire, the military, the bureaucracy, the infrastructure, but none of the new revenue from conquest. You have to maintain what you've built, defend what you've taken, and keep the population pacified. And that's when the pattern begins. Stage 1. Military overextension. Every empire reaches a point where its military commitments exceed its ability to fund them sustainably. Rome, at its peak, had legions stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia. 30 legions, 150,000 soldiers, plus auxiliaries, engineers, supply chains. The cost was staggering. By the 3rd century, military spending consumed 70% of the Roman budget, and still it wasn't enough. Enemies were everywhere. Persia in the east, Germanic tribes in the north, internal revolts constantly. The empire needed the military to survive, but the military was bankrupting the empire. The Ottomans faced the same trap. At their height, they controlled North Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Europe. The Janissaries, their elite infantry, numbered over 100,000, plus cavalry, plus garrisons, plus the navy. By the 1600s, military costs were consuming the entire state revenue. They had to keep paying or risk rebellion, but they had no way to increase income. Expansion had stopped. Britain in the 20th century, the same. After World War I, they had military commitments on 6 continents: India, Africa, the Middle East, the Pacific. Defending the empire cost more than the empire produced. By 1945, Britain was spending 25% of GDP on defense. Unsustainable, but unavoidable. Without the military, the empire collapses. With the military, the empire goes bankrupt. That's the trap. And here's the critical insight. Once you're overextended, you can't just pull back. Because the moment you withdraw from a territory, enemies move in. Allies lose confidence. Trade routes become insecure. The empire starts to fracture. So you have to keep spending, even when you know it's destroying you. Military overextension isn't a choice. It's a structural inevitability once expansion stops. Stage 2. Currency debasement. When the empire can't fund its military through taxes alone, it turns to the money supply. And every single empire has done the exact same thing. They debased the currency. Rome did it systematically. In 64 AD, under Nero, the silver content of the denarius was reduced from 100% to 90%. By 200 AD, it was 50% silver. By 270 AD, barely 5%. They kept stamping the same value on the coins, but the real metal content collapsed. Merchants weren't stupid. Prices exploded. What cost 1 denarius in 200 AD cost 10,000 denarii by 300 AD. The currency became worthless. The Ottomans did it with the akçe. In 1500, it was pure silver. By 1640, it was debased 10 times over. The government kept minting more coins, reducing silver content, trying to pay soldiers and bureaucrats. But everyone knew the money was fake. Inflation destroyed the economy. The akçe went from trusted currency to joke in 50 years. Britain did it by abandoning the gold standard. In 1914, the pound sterling was backed by gold. 1 pound equaled a fixed amount of gold guaranteed. By 1931, they couldn't maintain it. Too much debt, too little gold. They suspended convertibility. The pound lost 25% of its value overnight. The global reserve currency just admitted it was printing money without backing. Here's why debasement always happens. When taxes can't cover military costs, governments have 3 options. Cut spending, which means losing territory. Raise taxes, which causes rebellion. Or debase the currency, which is invisible to most people initially. They always choose debasement because it looks like a free solution. Print more money, pay the soldiers, keep the system running. But debasement doesn't create wealth. It just transfers it from everyone holding the currency to the government doing the printing. It's a hidden tax, and when people figure it out, trust in the currency collapses. Stage 3. Debt spiral. When currency debasement stops working, empires borrow. And just like military overextension, debt becomes a trap. Rome borrowed from wealthy senators and foreign merchants. By the 3rd century, emperors were defaulting on loans, confiscating estates, and executing creditors to avoid repayment. The empire couldn't borrow anymore because nobody trusted them. The Ottomans borrowed from European banks starting in the 1850s. By 1875, they owed so much that debt payments consumed 50% of state revenue. They defaulted in 1876. European powers imposed an international debt commission that controlled Ottoman finances. The empire lost sovereignty over its own budget. Britain borrowed massively during World War I and II. By 1945, they owed more than their entire GDP. Debt payments crippled them for decades. They couldn't afford the empire anymore. Not the military, not the administration, not the infrastructure. The debt forced decolonization. Debt is seductive because it allows you to keep spending without immediate consequences. You can maintain the military, fund the bureaucracy, and keep the population happy. But debt has to be repaid with interest. And when your economy isn't growing, when you're no longer conquering new territory, the debt compounds faster than you can service it. Eventually, you're borrowing just to pay interest on previous borrowing. That's the spiral. And once you're in it, there's no way out, except default or collapse. Stage 4. Wealth inequality. As the empire's finances deteriorate, wealth concentrates at the top. The wealthy landowners, merchants, senators avoid taxes through exemptions and corruption. The middle class gets crushed by taxation. The poor become desperate. This happened in Rome. By the late empire, massive estates owned by senators controlled most of the agricultural land. Small farmers were taxed into bankruptcy and forced to sell. Wealth inequality destroyed the tax base. The government couldn't collect revenue from the rich because they were too powerful. They couldn't collect from the poor Because they had nothing. The burden fell on the shrinking middle, which collapsed under the weight. The Ottomans saw the same. The elite, the janissaries, the palace officials lived in luxury, while peasants starved. Tax collection became predatory. Governors extracted everything they could, knowing the central government was weak. Rebellions became constant. Britain experienced it differently, but the result was identical. The aristocracy maintained wealth, while the working class faced poverty and unemployment after the wars. Social cohesion disintegrated. The empire couldn't function when the population turned against itself. Wealth inequality isn't just a moral issue, it's an economic death sentence. Because when the majority of the population is impoverished, they can't participate in the economy. They can't buy goods, can't pay taxes, can't support growth. The economy stagnates, and a stagnant economy can't fund an empire. Stage 5. Loss of productive capacity. Empires become dependent on conquest, on tribute, on extraction. They stop producing and start consuming. Rome in the late empire produced almost nothing. They imported grain from Egypt, silk from China, spices from India. They paid for it with debased currency and eventually couldn't afford imports. When supply chains broke down during barbarian invasions, the cities starved. The Ottomans lost their manufacturing base. By the 1700s, European goods were superior and cheaper. Ottoman workshops couldn't compete. They became importers, dependent on foreign production. When wars cut off trade, the economy collapsed. Britain deindustrialized after World War II. Manufacturing moved to America, Germany, Japan. Britain became a financial center, but financial services alone can't support an empire. When the empire dissolved, the economy contracted. This is the trap of empire. When you control vast territories, it's easier to extract than to produce. But extraction is finite. Eventually, the conquered territories are drained. And when you've lost the capacity to produce, when your economy is just moving wealth around instead of creating it, collapse is inevitable. Stage 6. Inflation spiral. All the previous stages, debasement, debt, lost production, converge into inflation. Prices rise faster than incomes. The currency becomes unreliable. People hoard real assets, gold, land, grain. They refuse paper money. The economy shifts to barter. Government authority evaporates because they can't pay soldiers, can't fund administration, can't deliver services. Rome saw inflation so severe that by 300 AD, the government was collecting taxes in goods instead of currency, because the currency was worthless. The Ottomans faced hyperinflation in the 1600s. Prices doubled, then doubled again. The government lost control. Stage 7. Collapse of trade and final implosion. When internal chaos makes trade impossible, when roads are unsafe, when currency is rejected, the empire fragments. Local strongmen take over. Provinces declare independence. The center loses control. And what was once a unified empire becomes dozens of squabbling territories. Rome fragmented into successor kingdoms. The Western Empire ended in 476, not with a battle, but with the last emperor being deposed by a barbarian general who didn't even bother taking the title. It just stopped existing. The Ottomans slowly disintegrated, territory by territory, crisis by crisis. By 1923, the empire was gone. Britain decolonized in 20 years, from ruling a quarter of the earth to a regional power. Here's the terrifying part. This isn't ancient history. This is the operating manual for imperial collapse. 7 stages, every single time. And the pattern is playing out right now. Not in some far-off nation. In the dominant economic systems of today. Military overextension. Check. The United States has 750 military bases in 80 countries. $850 billion annual military budget, commitments it cannot possibly fulfill simultaneously, currency debasement. Check. The dollar has lost 98% of its purchasing power since 1971. The money supply has increased 400% since 2000. We're printing unlimited currency backed by nothing but confidence. Debt spiral. Check. 36 trillion in debt. Interest payments approaching $1 trillion per year. Borrowing to pay interest. That's the definition of a spiral. Wealth inequality. Check. The top 1% owns more than the bottom 90%. The middle class is shrinking. Social cohesion is disintegrating. Loss of productive capacity. Check. We don't manufacture. We import. $800 billion trade deficit, dependent on foreign supply chains for everything. Inflation spiral. Starting. Prices rising faster than wages. Real purchasing power declining. People losing faith in the currency. Collapse of trade. Not yet. But the cracks are forming. Allies developing alternatives. Enemies testing boundaries. We're not at stage 7, but we're deep into stage 6. And history says once you reach this point, the sequence completes itself. Not slowly, quickly. Rome took centuries to fall because the world moved slowly. The Ottomans took decades. The Soviet Union took 900 days. The speed increases because information moves faster, because markets react faster, because once confidence breaks, the collapse accelerates. The pattern doesn't care about your technology, your military, or your confidence. The pattern is mathematical. You cannot spend beyond your means forever. You cannot print currency without destroying its value. You cannot maintain empire without productive capacity. The math doesn't lie. And history has run this experiment dozens of times. Every empire falls the same financial way, not because of external enemies, because of internal economic decay. 7 stages, predictable, inevitable, already underway. If this makes you see the pattern, if you recognize we're not approaching the danger but already inside it, then you understand what most people refuse to see. Subscribe, because when the final stages hit, you'll want to know what happened and why. The script was written 2,000 years ago, and we're reading from it line by line.